another record-setting penalty night Monday. The suspensions have been handed down for Steelers wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster and Bengals safety George IIoka. Both were suspended 1 game for their hits Monday, and both players will appeal their suspensions. Keep in mind, Rob Gronkowski received the exact same punishment for a much more egregious late hit on Tre'Davious White of the Bills Sunday. Gronk's appeal was heard yesterday, but the suspension was upheld. Donovan, I'll start with you. Were these suspensions handled correctly?
I don't think that they were handled correctly at all. I look at the Juju Schuster hit, and that's something that, while I played, that was one of the major hits coming back on a reverse or possibly for a big block. I mean, I know that the crown of his helmet hit the chin of Burfett, but that's something that happens in football. It's a bang-bang deal, and I look at it as not of a dirty play, but the actual act afterwards was one that I think a lot of football, people as far as in the league are concerned, are looking at it as a dirty play. You shouldn't have stood over him. That's just something you don't do. If you make the block, hey, we'll keep moving and try to make another block. Then you continue to go on to the George IIoka play. That's another bang-bang deal in the end zone. I mean, when a guy is exploding up top for a catch, I mean, where do you want him to hit him? He's right there in his chest. Antonio Brown ended up kind of crunching down, leaning his head down, and it ended up being another bang-bang deal where it hit him in the helmet. So I didn't think that they were dirty plays to the point where you needed to suspend them for 1 game. And then you compare that to what we've seen from Rob Gronkowski. Rob Gronkowski, from the very beginning, should have had 3 to 4 game suspension, where that allows him now to go ahead and try to appeal that. When you look at all across of the suspensions this year, I mean, the Trevathan to the Crabtree and Aqib Talib, which was suspended 2 games and 1 or 2 games, and then they appeal. I just think it's unfair for the way that, Roger Goodell and the rest of his staff has continued to look at these things and just all of a throw out a 1 game suspension when they should be a little bit more strenuous on how they're coming down. Those 2 that we've seen, now it was a rough game, not that Sunday night, but it was a rough game. I just think for Pittsburgh Steelers as well as the Cincinnati Bengals, we really need to think about those suspensions.
I want to start with something that Stephen A. said the other day, Donovan, about Tom Brady when he was being demonstrative toward his offensive coordinator on the sidelines. And Stephen A. said, what if Brady was a black quarterback? If he was an African-American quarterback, would the reaction be the same? Would he be allowed to, quote-unquote, get away with that kind of behavior? And it would just be called, intense. I didn't think that was the best example at the time. Stephen A. explained himself, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it in the future. Because I thought the better example there was actually Gronkowski and the reaction to Gronk. I do think race plays a part. Gronkowski has cultivated an image as a big, fun-loving guy. And as someone who's interacted with him a couple times, he was on Sports Nation, I've run into him and dealt with him a little bit. He is a big, fun-loving guy. Love Gronkowski. Who doesn't? So I'm not saying he doesn't deserve that. And I'm also not saying, by the way, that some African-American players can't also cultivate that image. I think of Charles Barkley, for example, in the NBA, right? I'm just saying it's more difficult for African-American players to cultivate that image. And it's far easier, and in an unknowable way, but in this way, I believe an obvious way, race does play a part. So, for example, if that was Martellus Bennett, who did the exact same thing as Gronk, let's keep the suspension aside for a second. What would the reaction have been? Would there have been outrage? Oh, my God. Thuggish behavior, et cetera, never mind the fact that Martellus Bennett is kind of an intellectual, and Gronk is kind of the fun-loving caveman, right? But somehow it works for him in this context, and maybe that plays into something. His public persona plays into the fact that it's a 1 game suspension. Gronk should get minimum 2. You got to start at 2. I said originally at least the game, blah, blah, blah. You're right. It was the most egregious foul of the season. It should have been minimum of 2 games, and I believe that at least tangentially, at least in the sense that he never had to worry about being perceived as menacing or thuggish or anything like that, race plays a role here.
Well, let me add to that, Max. Let me just ask you a question. I mean, from the Juju Smith, the George IIoka, and I can even go Danny Trevathan. Out of those 3, which one would you say is the most violent hit that possibly could have seriously hurt one of the football players or individuals in the league?
You're talking about including the Gronk hit?
Including the Gronk hit.
Gronk hit by far. He was not only down by contact, he was also out of bounds. Gronk took 2-3 little stutter steps, gave him a forearm shiver in his brainstem. Of course, the Gronk hit.
Well, I mean, it's funny because that was only given a 1 game suspension. Danny Trevathan was given 2 before he appealed, and it was now dropped to 1. And then the Juju Smith and IIoka, I mean, it's one to me, I think, I love your angle and what you're talking about, and I personally agree with you as well with that. But when I look at just the way things have been going in the NFL, first and foremost, it's been bad football. It's been bad football. Yeah, we can look at it and say it's been parity because of the kind of equality of the football teams, because they really can't pick anyone in the AFC besides New England, maybe Pittsburgh. And then you look at the NFC, it's really the teams that's really been highlighted all throughout the year that we talk about. But just these hits alone, to me, it looks like it's drawing a bad message to all the viewers out there going forward, because we're allowing this to happen and we're only suspending them for one game. Rob Gronkowski should have had 4-game suspension from the very beginning.
I think one of the things that you're touching on.
He sent him to concussion protocol, which we didn't mention Tre'Davious White.
Right.
Absolutely.
I think that one. And it was not only the dirtiest, but it was also the most dangerous. You know, like in addition to being the dirtiest, because down by contact, out of bounds, you take steps, you have time to think about what you're doing, and then what you did, it was all like the worst. When you talk about all the different suspensions and different punishments, et cetera, and this is something Louis Riddick has been talking about all over our network recently, what is the punishment? What are the guidelines? No one knows. And this gets to my other point, which is when you have leadership, Roger Goodell, who wants all the power, right? The commissioner and the league battles. They fight the players' union so they can have all the power. They want to be judge, jury, and executioner. Then, okay, now you have all the responsibility. As Uncle Ben and Spider-Man said, Donovan McNabb, with great power comes great responsibility. But now you have all the responsibility. People are looking at you. Then they have to question, what's your style of leadership? Well, if you're feckless, if you are constantly reacting to everything, trying to put your finger in the wind to gauge which way the wind is blowing, how much outrage there is, and kind of apply a Band-Aid solution, try to figure out what the formula is, what's the proportion, will this assuage the public outcry in each and every instance, there's no consistency. We don't know ahead of time what the punishment's going to be. It would be much easier if they were out in front of it and said, okay, if you do this, then this happens. If you do that, then that happens. But they don't. They kind of react to each individual circumstance. So you bring up the Juju Smith-Schuster hit. Donovan, you're right. It was barely dirty. It was vicious, but it was barely dirty. Perfect is going to make a play. He put what they used to call a crackback block, right? But his helmet was a little too high, so it hit him in the face mask. So really what people are reacting to there is the fact that it's Steeler-Bengals. They know there's a blood feud there. It's perfect. They know what he did to Antonio Brown, who later walked by and said, karma. It's the fact that he stood over him and yelled at him, and it's the fact that Perfect was concussed, and in a very violent game. That even the Shazier, I mean, like, people don't even want to think about that. Actually, the Perfect hit became the signature play of the game. So for all those reasons, it got blown up out of proportion. But there is no way that deserves the same penalty as the Gronk hit. But there are no clear guidelines, and you don't have a commissioner who's willing to either cede some power so he doesn't have all the responsibility, or not just react to everything, get out in front of it.
Well, not only that, Max, it just seems like he's trying to please everybody at this particular point because of what we've heard thus far throughout the Ezekiel Elliott suspension. Then Bob Kraft getting involved, talking about Tom Brady being suspended. Now we have these illegal hits that are going on in the NFL, which now has put more pressure on Roger Goodell to try to please everyone and please the viewers and say that, hey, I have control over this whole deal. Policing this whole deal when you're pinpointing different issues in which they really have no weight. I mean, as far as Juju Schuster is concerned and George IIoka, that's just something we seen on national TV, and then the way the game went, especially after the Shazier hit and the injury, and we pray for him and hopefully to get a speedy recovery to get back. But I just think they need to reevaluate the whole situation with the Rob Gronkowski hit and add more games of suspension to it.
100%. So there's been 8 suspensions for on-field actions this season so far. But, gentlemen, speaking of the game being dangerous, Big Ben, who's played 14 years in the NFL, said on his weekly radio appearance for 93.7 The Fan in Pittsburgh that he wants his son to play another sport over football. Take a listen.
When we talked at the end in the offseason about, really evaluating